Okay, let's unpack this. It's something I think a lot of us feel, right? You walk around your city, maybe you see tent encampments, people clearly having a tough time. And then you hear the news. Unemployment is low, the economy's growing, and there's this clash. It just doesn't seem to add up.
Yeah, that contradiction, that disconnect between the official story and the reality on the ground, that's exactly what the source material for today's deep dive tackles head on.
We're looking at a text by José Julio Córdova Jaramillo, written with an AI collaborator named Onto.
That's right. And the core argument is pretty provocative. It's saying this gap isn't some unfortunate side effect. It's baked into the system because of how we measure success.
So the tools we use, like the official unemployment rate, GDP, the source argues they're actually creating a kind of illusion.
Exactly. A metric illusion is the term used. It paints a picture of progress that, according to the text, hides widespread suffering and maybe even systemic breakdown.
Okay, so our goal today is to really get into that argument. We want to understand why the source thinks these traditional numbers are misleading.
And crucially, what it proposes instead. We're talking new metrics, whole new systems for governance and economics.
And maybe the most interesting part, how the source suggests you, listening right now, can actually start to challenge this right in your own community.
Yeah, it's not just pointing fingers. It's offering a blueprint for, well, a pretty radical redesign.
It sounds like a huge topic.
Yeah.
So let's dive in, starting with the problem itself, these traditional metrics.
You do it.
All right, so the source really goes after these big established indicators, the unemployment rate, specifically U3, the one we always hear about, and GDP. It calls them part of this metric illusion. What does that mean, practically speaking?
Well, Chapter 1 in the intro really lay it out. The argument is these numbers give us a false sense of security, a narrative of stability, while ignoring deep-seated issues. Let's start with U3 unemployment.
Okay, the headline number.
Right. And the critique zeroes in on its definition. To be counted as unemployed by U3, you have to be jobless, actively looking for work in the last 4 weeks, and available to start within 2 weeks.
Sounds simple enough on the surface.
It does, but the source argues the key is who gets left out by that narrow definition.
And the text suggests that's a lot of people.
A huge number, yeah. Think about the underemployed. Someone with a master's degree working 15 hours a week at a coffee shop because that's all they can find. They're not unemployed by U3.
Or people who've just stopped looking.
Exactly. The discouraged workers, maybe they live somewhere with no jobs or face discrimination or just lost hope. If you haven't actively looked in 4 weeks, U3 doesn't count you. Poof, you vanish from the headline statistic.
Okay.
Then there are gig workers, right? Their hours can be wildly unstable, income unpredictable. Are they truly employed in a meaningful, stable sense? U3 often says yes.
Even if they're struggling.
Even if they're working full-time hours across multiple gigs and still can't make ends meet, living in poverty, technically employed.
Wow.
And critically, the source points out it completely misses the homeless population, who face enormous barriers to even applying for jobs, let alone meeting the available now criteria. Same for people with severe mental or physical health issues.
Yeah, there's that line in the source. It says the definition does not count the people whose lives most need to be counted. That really hits hard.
It does, and the source suggests this isn't accidental. It argues U3 wasn't designed to measure human thriving or dignity.
Sure.
It was built to monitor labor supply for industrial production, for capital.
Yeah.
It serves that purpose.
Okay, so it measures a very specific slice of the labor market relevant to that older economic model.
That's the argument.
All right, so what about GDP? Gross domestic product, that's the other big one, always cited as proof the economy is doing well.
Similar critique from the source here. GDP measures the total market value of all finished goods and services produced in a country. The problem: it treats all economic activity as positive, no matter what that activity is.
Can you give some examples from the text? Because they really make you think.
They do. Okay, so a hurricane hits, massive destruction. The rebuilding effort requires buying lumber, hiring contractors, lots of spending. GDP goes up.
Because money is changing hands?
Exactly. Or, say, rates of chronic illness, like cancer, rise. More doctor visits, more treatments, more pharmaceuticals sold. GDP goes up.
So sickness contributes to growth.
In GDP terms, yes. Rising rents, people spending more on housing, increases GDP. Building more prisons and spending more on incarceration, that adds to GDP too. Increased prescription drug sales for anxiety or depression boosts GDP.
That's unsettling. You could have a society dealing with disaster recovery, widespread illness, unaffordable housing, locking more people up, and medicating heavily, And the main economic indicator says things are growing.
Precisely. The source argues GDP measures the volume of transactions, the churn of money, but it's blind to the quality of life, sustainability, or the human cost. It tracks motion, not meaning or well-being. Again, it's seen as a metric optimized for capital flow, not human health.
Okay, this sets up Chapter 2, when success hides collapse. The idea that relying only on low U3 and high GDP creates this official success story that just feels wrong when you look around.
Right. You get the government report saying economy's strong, but then you see food banks overwhelmed, shelters full, housing costs making people desperate. The source argues these aren't separate issues happening despite a strong economy.
It argues they're connected, or even caused by that focus.
That's the provocative claim, that a system laser-focused on maximizing GDP and maintaining a narrow definition of employment inevitably produces these other outcomes. It prioritizes certain kinds of economic activity and labor over community stability, affordable housing, or mental wellness.
So the system is working as designed, but the design itself produces these hidden costs, like homelessness or time poverty.
That's the thesis. The source says it is the result of the system working exactly as designed. Those costs get externalized, pushed onto individuals and communities, while the headline numbers look good.
And this leads to what the source calls a distorted feedback loop.
Yeah. Picture this. Policymakers look at the good U3 and GDP numbers. They might think, oh, okay, the economy's fundamentally sound, so these social problems must be due to something else, maybe individual failings. So policy responses might miss the mark.
While on the ground,
People are feeling the squeeze, rent stress, stagnant wages, no time, anxiety. But the official data tells them things are fine. It creates the huge disconnect.
that sounds like a recipe for losing faith in the system entirely.
Absolutely. The source argues it erodes civic trust because the system seems blind or indifferent to lived reality. It's speaking a different language than the people it's supposed to serve.
And that connects to another powerful phrase the source uses, the cruelty of economic abstraction.
That concept gets at how systemic problems get twisted into personal failures. If the numbers say the economy is good and jobs are plentiful, even if they're low-wage, unstable jobs, then the person struggling isn't seen as potentially let down by the system.
They're seen as not trying hard enough or making bad choices.
Exactly. Like that example of the single parent juggling multiple jobs but still unable to afford decent housing. The abstraction frames it as their problem, they're failing, rather than looking at wage stagnation versus housing costs or the lack of affordable childcare. The individual gets the blame, and the system's role remains unexamined, unmeasured.
So, connecting this back to the title,
Yeah.
the tents in the cities aren't just some separate tragic issue.
According to the source, no. They are intrinsically linked. They are the visible outcome, the human consequence of relying on measurement systems that prioritize market value and a narrow view of labor over fundamental human needs like shelter, stability, and dignity. They are two sides of the same measurement logic.
Wow, okay. So if the old metrics are failing us, hiding the truth, maybe even causing harm, what's the alternative? How do we start measuring things in a way that actually reflects human well-being? This must be where the source starts building its case for something new.
It is. Part 2 pivots exactly there. The argument becomes, to heal the suffering, first you have to see it clearly. And that requires designing and using what the source calls conscious metrics.
Conscious metrics. Okay, so it's moving beyond that measurement blindness you mentioned.
Yes, that's the term used. Again, the idea that our dominant metrics just weren't built to see things like stress, time poverty, community connection, or housing security. Conscious metrics are proposed as the antidote.
What makes them conscious? How are they different?
The source describes them as a different kind of number. Their explicit purpose is to restore sight to the system itself, making visible the invisible, the pain points, the pressures, the human experiences that U3 and GDP ignore. Things like rent burden, time exhaustion, eroding trust, mental health strain.
So less about abstract national aggregates and more about ground-level reality.
Exactly. They're not designed for flashy headlines or global competitiveness rankings. They're designed for local insight, for communities and neighborhoods to understand what's really going on, to guide local action.
Does the source give concrete examples? What would replace, say, the unemployment rate?
It does. The cornerstone proposal is the Multidimensional Labor Mental Health Housing Index, or MLHHI. This is presented as a potential replacement for U3, offering a much richer, more holistic view of stability.
Multidimensional. Labor, mental health, housing. What goes into calculating that?
According to the text, it combines scores from those three critical areas. First, labor dignity. This isn't just employed, unemployed. It looks at job stability, safety, fair wages relative to local living costs, benefits like health insurance, paid leave. The quality of work.
Okay.
Second, mental health. This index would track things like access to care, community support availability, reported levels of stress or well-being, social connection.
And third, housing accessibility.
Right. Crucially, this measures the relationship between local wages and the actual cost of secure housing, rent, utilities, maybe even transport if affordable options are far away. Can people realistically afford to live where they work?
So the MLHHI gives you a picture. Like maybe someone is employed according to U3, but their MLHHI score is low because their job is precarious, they have no access to mental health support, and rent eats up 60% of their income.
Precisely. It reveals the precarity that U3 completely hides. It connects the dots between these fundamental aspects of life that traditional data keeps separate.
And the MLHHI isn't the only one proposed.
No, it's foundational, but the source outlines others, like the Time Wealth Index.
That one really jumped out at me. So relevant.
Isn't it? It measures discretionary time, the time left over after work, commute, childcare, elder care, basic chores are done. It's framed as an obligation versus restoration ratio. How much time do you actually have to rest, connect, pursue interests, just be?
Something GDP definitely doesn't care about.
Not at all. But the source argues it's a vital sign of systemic stress. Are long commutes forced by housing costs? Is lack of affordable care eating up all free time? It makes that visible. Then there's the rent stress ratio.
More specific than just average rent.
Yeah, it looks at the actual percentage of household income going to housing and related costs like utilities and maybe essential transport. It quantifies that burden, and also a civic stress gradient, how seen, heard, respected, and safe people feel in their community and interacting with local government. And a trauma visibility index. Does the system recognize, track, and respond to community and individual trauma?
These sound like powerful concepts, but are they just ideas, or does the source see them as practical tools?
Very much presented as practical. The vision is for these to be used in real-time dashboards at the neighborhood level, maybe accessible via apps, discussed in town halls, used by citizens for audits, making these human signals usable and actionable.
And the source stresses that changing the metric changes the goal.
This is huge. The metrics as narrative and design tools idea. If U3 is king, the system optimizes for getting people into any job. If GDP rules, it optimizes for transactions regardless of consequence.
But if MLHHI or rent stress becomes primary?
Then the system has to optimize for those things. Decent work, mental well-being, affordable housing. It shifts the entire goalpost. The narrative changes from work harder to let's measure the barriers and fix the system. It reframes the whole conversation.
Which leads to that quote, every metric is a sentence. Every number is a decision. What we count becomes what we govern.
It nails it, right? Metrics aren't passive observers. They actively shape reality by defining what we pay attention to and what we resource. And if U3 can't explain the tents on the sidewalk and the source says it never could, then we need metrics that can. MLHHI, time wealth, rent stress, these are the tools for repair.
Okay, so conscious metrics offer a way to see the problems clearly. But that raises a big question. If the problems are visible, maybe not through U3, but through lived experience, and solutions like conscious metrics are conceivable, why are we still stuck with the old ones? Why hasn't the system adopted something better? The source addresses this resistance, doesn't it?
It absolutely does, particularly in Chapter 9. And it doesn't just chalk it up to laziness or lack of imagination. The argument is that the persistence of flawed metrics serves the interests of the existing power structure.
It's not just that nobody thought of better numbers.
No, the source frames it as more intentional than that. It lays out 4 main reasons why change is so difficult, even when the current metrics are clearly inadequate for measuring human well-being. The first is what it calls inertia by design.
Inertia by design.
Meaning, the idea is that legacy metrics like U3 and GDP aren't just numbers. They prop up a specific narrative of success that benefits those currently in power. Low unemployment looks good for politicians. GDP growth justifies certain economic policies. Changing the metrics would mean changing the definition of success, which would inevitably challenge the status quo and require reallocating resources and power. So there's a built-in resistance to rocking the boat.
The metrics function to maintain the current system, even if that system isn't working for everyone.
That's the core argument. The second reason is termed ideological blindness. The source points to the powerful influence of economic ideologies that champion free markets as efficient and rational, emphasize individual responsibility, and advocate for minimal government.
We touched on this, the idea that if the market doesn't provide affordable housing or mental health care, that's just how it is.
Right. From that viewpoint, unemployment or homelessness are seen less as systemic failures and more as individual issues or the unfortunate but acceptable outcomes of market forces. This ideology naturally favors metrics like GDP and U3 because they align with a market-centric view. It dismisses metrics focused on social well-being as less important or even irrelevant. What the market excludes is irrelevant, as the source puts it. This thinking is deeply embedded.
So the prevailing economic philosophy reinforces the use of metrics that support that philosophy.
It's a feedback loop. The third reason is institutional fragmentation. Think about how government is structured. You have a Department of Labor tracking jobs, HUD tracking housing, HHS tracking health. They operate in silos.
So no single agency is looking at the whole picture, like how job loss impacts mental health impacts housing stability.
Exactly. That interconnected reality, where people's lives unfold across these domains, isn't captured by any one agency's metrics. Problems fall through the cracks between these institutional silos. The suffering becomes invisible at the systemic level because the data isn't integrated. It's nobody's specific job to track the MLHHI, so to speak.
It gets lost in the gaps.
And the fourth reason the source highlights is political utility.
The sound bites.
Precisely. U3 and GDP are simple, easy to understand, easy to report, easy to use in campaign ads. Unemployment is down. Economy grew X%. They're powerful political tools.
Whereas explaining the nuances of the Time Wealth Index
is much harder. It's complex. It might reveal uncomfortable truths. It forces accountability for things politicians might prefer to ignore. Conscious metrics are more honest, the source argues, but they're politically risky because they complicate the simple success narratives. The easy, even if misleading, number often wins in the political arena.
So to sum up this part, the source isn't saying U3 and GDP are useless.
No, it says they succeed at what they were built for: tracking narrow labor activity for capital, measuring market transactions. They didn't fail, they just weren't built to measure human flourishing. The conclusion drawn is stark. The solution isn't incremental improvement, it's replacement with metrics designed for a fundamentally different goal.
But if the system is so entrenched, so resistant to changing its core measurements, how do you actually build something new? How do you implement these conscious metrics? This seems like the biggest hurdle. Where does the source go next?
It goes into proposing a whole new civic architecture. This is where it gets really ambitious. Across chapters 5, 6, 7, and 11, it's not just about new numbers. It's about building new structures that use those numbers to prioritize healing and dignity, starting at the local level.
Decentralizing power.
Big time. The foundation is System AN, Administration of Autonomous Neighborhoods, laid out in Chapter 5. The critique is that current governance is too distant, too generalized. Decisions made downtown or in the capital based on aggregate data just don't connect with the specific needs of, say, Elm Street versus Oak Avenue.
The AN tries to fix that distance.
Exactly. It envisions neighborhoods as metric-sensitive, self-governing organisms. Instead of relying solely on citywide data, each AAN neighborhood would generate and track its own hyperlocal, real-time data.
Using those conscious metrics we talked about.
Yes. The source suggests potentially tracking hundreds, even thousands of local indicators, with each neighborhood prioritizing maybe 25 to 50 key performance indicators based on their specific reality. Things like their local time wealth average, their specific rent-stress ratio, the civic trust level block by block, trauma rates, food desert issues, noise pollution, whatever matters there.
And this isn't just data collection for reports. It drives action.
That's the absolute key. Every number feeds into action. The AAN dashboard isn't just informational, it's the operating system for local decision-making, for allocating resources within the neighborhood, for designing interventions.
How would that work in practice? Give me an example.
Okay, say the AAN dashboard for neighborhood X shows a sharp rise in the rent stress ratio among families with young children. The AAN system, instead of waiting months for a city study, immediately flags this. It triggers local meetings, maybe activates pre-planned protocols for emergency rental assistance funded locally, or initiates exploration of co-op housing models within neighborhood X.
So it drastically shortens the response time, bypasses layers of bureaucracy.
That's the goal, to make governance immediately responsive to ground truth. The source calls it deepening democracy, organizing complexity locally, building systems for the world we actually live in, which is experienced neighborhood by neighborhood. It's the systemic answer to the tense installing sensors and responders right where the problems manifest.
But who runs this? If it's not the traditional city council member for the whole district,
Yeah.
who manages this hyperlocal system?
That leads to the concept of the administrator cincinnato in Chapter 6. The argument is that the AAN system needs a new kind of leader, a civic steward, not a traditional politician focused on broader districts or party politics.
The name comes from the Roman figure.
Yeah, loosely based on that idea of temporary civic service focused on a specific task. This cincinnato would be a local figure, maybe elected, appointed, maybe rotated, operating under a very clear contract with the neighborhood.
In their job description.
Their sole mandate: protect and improve the measurable well-being of that specific neighborhood based on the real-time AAN conscious metrics dashboard. That's it.
How is that different from a mayor or councilor?
Key differences highlighted. Their dashboard is public, constantly visible. Their schedule, transparent. Their success isn't measured by votes, polls, or fundraising, but solely by demonstrable improvements in the neighborhood's MLHHI, time wealth, rent stress, civic trust, etc. Their power is limited, guided by the data, overseen by neighborhood assemblies. The goal is tangible improvement, not political performance.
So their legitimacy comes directly from metric-based results.
Exactly. They're less a politician, more a civic health manager. Their day-to-day involves watching the dashboard like a hawk. Mental health index dips. They coordinate with local clinics or support groups. Time wealth drops. They investigate commute patterns or childcare availability and work on solutions. Rent stress spikes. They interface with the funding mechanism, the CSES, to get resources flowing.
They're the human interface between the neighborhood's data and concrete action.
That's a good way to put it. They translate the signals from the conscious metrics into coordinated local responses. They bring governance right down to the street level, ensuring proximity allows for noticing, caring, and changing things. They make sure the people the old system overlooked the homeless, the precarious are seen because their plight directly impacts the metrics the Cincinnato is judged on.
Hence that line, the unemployment rate cannot be held accountable. The Cincinnato can. It localizes responsibility.
Correctly. Someone is now accountable for acting on the data that reflects human suffering and well-being at the neighborhood scale.
Okay, that makes sense. But it all hinges on resources. If the current system funds things based on GDP and U3 logic, how does this new 8 Cincinnato structure get the money it needs to actually do anything based on conscious metrics?
This is where the third pillar comes in. CSES, the Conscious System of Economic Support, explained in Chapter 7. It tackles exactly that problem, how current economics treats things like trauma care, housing stability, or community trust as externalities that don't get funded until there's a massive crisis, if ever.
CSES aims to change that. Make funding follow need as defined by conscious metrics.
Precisely. It aims to realign investment with healing. The core mechanism is metric triggers. Funding isn't based on political negotiation or annual budget fights. It's automatically triggered when specific conscious metrics on a neighborhood's AAN dashboard cross preset thresholds.
Wow. So if a neighborhood's trauma index hits a certain critical level, bang, funding for trauma support flows to that neighborhood automatically.
That's the concept. Or if the rent stress ratio goes over, say, 50% for a significant number of residents, funds earmarked for local rent relief or affordable housing projects are released. The source stresses this isn't charity, it's systemic stabilization. Dealing with these issues early via triggered funding is seen as far cheaper and more effective than waiting for full-blown crises. It makes funding proactive, preventative.
Where does the money in the CSES pool come from initially?
The source proposes several potential avenues. Things like civic performance bonds, where investors get returns based on improvements in conscious metrics. Maybe neighborhood-level microtaxes linked to local well-being indices. Social impact contracts with local businesses who benefit from a stable community. Voluntary contributions, too. But the crucial design principle is that the allocation of funds is metric-coupled.
The data pulls the trigger, not a committee or politician.
Exactly. Every dollar is tied to a civic condition. This direct link is designed to prevent funds from being diverted for political reasons and ensure they respond directly to the needs identified by the conscious metrics. It tackles the huge lag time in current funding models. CSES acts on the early warnings.
And the Cincinnato works with this system.
Yes, they'd likely work with a CSES financial liaison. When metrics cross thresholds, the Cincinnato helps direct the triggered funds to the most effective local interventions based on the dashboard data and community input. As the source puts it, metrics move money, not debates.
So the CSES provides the financial engine to respond to the human realities that U3 and GDP ignore, making sure that measuring suffering actually leads to resources to alleviate it.
It makes the invisible, visible suffering legible to capital, or at least legible to a dedicated funding stream, ensuring that metrics focused on care actually get resourced. It builds the response mechanism into the system's financial DNA.
And these pieces, the metrics, AAN, Cincinnati, CSES, the source, integrates them into a larger framework.
Briefly, yes, in Chapter 11. It's called the Conscious Metrics Engine, CME. Think of it as the overarching operating system, a living system or civilizational nervous system.
A nervous system?
Sensing and responding.
That's the metaphor. The CME is designed to collect the data from citizens, neighborhoods via AAN, interpret it using MLHHI, maybe AI for pattern recognition and prediction, trigger action via Cincinnati and CSES, get feedback, monitoring intervention impact, adapting metrics, and integrate learning across different neighborhoods. So its purpose is to create that tight loop. Measure local reality truthfully, interpret it, respond effectively, learn, and adapt.
That's the vision. Opt-in, hyperlocal, context-aware, predictive, making things like homelessness or mental health crises not afterthoughts, but core indicators the entire system is designed to monitor and proactively address.
This is fundamental redesign. It's huge. It could feel overwhelming, like something only experts or governments could even attempt. But the source doesn't stop there, does it? It brings it right back to the individual listener.
Absolutely. And this is maybe the most crucial part for people wondering, what can I possibly do? Chapters 8 and 12 focus on this. It circles back to that initial feeling of disconnect. Maybe you are employed, but you're exhausted, stressed about rent, feeling disconnected. The source validates that feeling intensely.
It says that feeling is real, even if the official numbers don't reflect it.
Exactly. It says you're not failing. The metrics are failing to capture your reality. And then it introduces citizen metrics, the idea that you can start using these conscious metric principles right now in your own life as a form of civic self-auditing.
Not for self-help, but as a civic act.
Precisely. It's about applying those conscious metrics personally. Think about your own time wealth. How much real free time do you have? What's your actual rent-stress ratio, counting everything? How would you rate your mental health stability, your civic trust in your immediate area, your risk of being displaced?
Measuring those things for yourself, it gives language to that unease.
That's the idea. It gives form to what is often dismissed as personal weakness. It helps you articulate, no, this isn't just me being bad with money. The rent-stress ratio in my neighborhood is objectively unsustainable given local wages. It shifts the frame from personal failing to systemic pressure.
But how does me calculating my time wealth actually change anything bigger?
The source sees it as the starting point. Your individual dashboard, when shared and combined with neighbors doing the same thing, creates that initial hyper-local data signal. This is the raw data that can feed into a neighborhood AAN initiative, inform a potential micro-Cincinnati, even eventually justify triggering CSES resources. Your lived experience becomes data that drives real policy, is the promise. The loop is closed.
So my reality, quantified, becomes input for the very system designed to respond to it.
That's the revolutionary potential outline. It restores agency. Your feelings aren't just feelings, they're data points indicating system performance, grounded in evidence you generated yourself.
But the source also warns about something getting in the way of even doing this self-assessment. The digital distraction machine in Chapter 10.
Yeah, this is flagged as a major obstacle. The argument is that our current digital environment, social media, news feeds, is designed to fragment attention, amplify outrage and conflict because it drives engagement, and actively works against the kind of quiet reflection and sustained focus needed to understand complex systems or even assess our own lives accurately.
Making it harder to see the suffering around us, and maybe even within us.
That's the claim. Simple numbers like U3 thrive in that environment. Complex, nuanced metrics get drowned out. And personally, it creates civic numbness. Problems become background noise. Change feels impossible, and the constant distraction prevents the self-auditing needed for citizen metrics.
If you can't sit quietly with your own experience, you can't measure your time wells or rent stress.
Right. Distraction becomes anesthesia, the source warns. It hides your truth. So reclaiming focus, being intentional about attention, is presented almost as a prerequisite civic duty for this whole conscious metrics approach to work.
Which brings us to the final piece. Okay, I'm focused. I want to start. What do I actually do? Chapter 12 lays out steps, right?
Yes, very practical steps for starting right where you are with your neighbors. It stresses you don't need permission or a grant. You just start. 6 steps are outlined.
Okay, step 1.
Measure what's missing. Get a small group together, neighbors, friends. Do a mini audit of your block or building. Use the citizen metric ideas. What's the rough rent burden? How easy is it to get mental health support nearby? How long are commutes? How often do neighbors actually talk? Aim for directional truth, just making the invisible visible to yourselves.
Step 2.
Create a local metrics dashboard. Make your findings visible. A poster, a shared Google Doc, a whiteboard in a common area, maybe even a small mural. Just get the key numbers out there persistently.
Step 3 involves a person.
Elect or rotate a micro-Cincinnati. Choose someone in the group to be the steward of this local dashboard. Not a boss, but a facilitator. Keep the data updated, gather feedback, be the point person. Their role is defined by action based on the local metrics.
Step 4. Take action.
Prototype 1, small civic intervention. Look at your dashboard. What's the biggest pain point revealed? Design one small thing to address it. High rent stress. Organize a tenant rates workshop. Low time wealth. Start a tool sharing library or a childcare swap. Low civic trust. Host a simple potluck. Crucially, document the impact. Update the dashboard. Did it work? Let the data guide the next step.
Step 5 is about consistency.
Build loops of civic trust. Make it regular, meet monthly, review the metrics, share stories, plan the next small action. Trust builds through this repeated cycle, seeing the truth together, acting together, seeing the results together.
And the last step, look outwards.
Connect horizontally. Once your group has a rhythm, reach out to the next block over or a similar community group. Share your dashboard template, your process, what you learned, offer your model as a seed. The idea is this grows organically, neighbor to neighbor, not top down.
The source really emphasizes that this is how it starts, in the cracks of the old system.
Exactly. This is how the new system begins, where the old system cannot follow. It's about building better definitions of reality, better systems of care right where you live, based on measuring what truly matters to the people living there.
So bringing it all back home, that initial paradox, low unemployment numbers, high levels of visible distress like tent cities.
This deep dive suggests that paradox isn't a paradox at all. It's the logical outcome of relying on illusion metrics numbers like U3 and GDP that were never designed to measure human dignity or well-being, and in fact, actively obscure the struggles faced by many.
And the alternative proposed by the source isn't just tweaking those numbers, but a complete overhaul. Creating conscious metrics that see human reality, building hyperlocal responsive governance like System AN led by data-driven Cincinnatos, funding it through metric-triggered systems like CSES, and integrating it all via a conscious metrics engine.
A fundamental shift towards measuring and valuing things like time wealth, rent stress, trauma visibility, civic trust, the actual fabric of human life.
And the critical message for everyone listening is that you're not just a spectator in this. The source argues your own lived experience, your struggles that the official numbers miss, are valid. And through citizen metrics and local action, starting small, you can begin to measure your own truth and become the starting point for building these new, more humane systems from the ground up.
It's about reclaiming data dignity, insisting that your reality counts, and using that data to build systems that actually care.
So maybe the final thought to leave you with, inspired directly by this source material, is this. What would it mean, really, to measure the things that make your life feel human? Your time, your safety, your connections, your rest.
And if we collectively started counting that, not just in government reports, but in our own lives, on our own blocks, how would that change the story we tell about our communities? How would it change what we choose to focus on, what we choose to fix?
Because, as the source powerfully argues, what gets counted gets resourced.
What would you want to see resourced in your life, in your neighborhood, that isn't being counted now?
The official story of success might be missing the most vital chapters. But the power to start writing a truer story, well, it might be closer than you think.
That's the deep dive for today.